We're lagging behind. So we're going to talk about why Britain is lagging behind on the journey to decentralisation. In the moments of in-your-face tyranny, like we experienced during COVID, people will respond. They'll take to the streets, they'll fill out petitions, they'll rally online. But outside of those periods, we go into these periods of kind of comfort again. But as we talked about last night in the central bank digital currencies, this is a train that's left the station and it's accelerating. So we've got to get out of this comfort zone, I think, in the UK. And we're going to look at crypto adoption. We're going to look at solutions and where we're behind in solutions. And we're going to reference what we learned in our trip recently to Morelia, the Greater Reset, which showcased some amazing solutions from around the world and how we can take inspiration from what's happening in different parts of the planet and how we can bring some of that to our shores here in the UK. So whether you're listening from the UK or you're from further afield, this podcast is going to be packed full of lessons about how you can apply some of these lessons to your life. So it's going to be an exciting episode, so buckle up. Let's get ready. So Sam, we're back here with the Uncharted Territory podcast, fresh from our trip to Mexico, where we went to Morelia, the cultural capital of Mexico, for this incredible 5-day summit. It's the 5th edition of the Greater Reset, or the People's Reset, as an antidote to the World Economic Forum in Davos, really focusing on the true nature of the problems of our time and exploring solutions. And to me, Sam, before I pass to you, my personal experience is that this is the most positive, optimistic, solution-focused seminar that I've been to in the last 3 to 4 years. Give me really great hope and inspiration. And I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I thought it was really dynamic, Dan. It's inspiring to get perspectives from all over the world, people from different cultures, different areas, and share a lot of stories. I know we did outside of just going to the talks and, just sharing with all different attendees about their perspective the last 3 years, obviously all the common ground we live, but also, like you said, different angles on where to go from here. And I think it is really interesting, particularly as, we're based in the UK, Dan, just trying to compare where people are on that spectrum of taking action and moving forward. And also some of the kind of UK-centric ideas that maybe are lagging behind some of the other ideas, partly because of a perceived, around certain things, we might come to it, around things like cash and fiat currency, a perceived idea of security that's greater in this country than it is in a lot of those other countries, particularly in South America, where they have a different relationship with it and different, some of those problems are more visceral and been more visceral in their lifetime. So I thought getting those perspectives was really interesting. And it's inspired us to move forward and keep having good discussions and keep educating and keep getting the story out there.
Yeah, so I opened up in the front of this episode about lagging behind in crypto. There's an interesting report that came out recently which shows, it's on chainanalysis.com, which kind of breaks down, based on 2023 data, which countries are furthest ahead when it comes to adoption of crypto. India leads by far, but then you've got countries like Nigeria, Vietnam, Turkey, Ukraine, all countries that have been through various different social upheavals in recent times. United Kingdom is lagging quite far behind when it comes to adoption. And you're right. When we were in Morelia, the conversation around cash was very different to what we have here. The conversation around technology and crypto is very different to what we have here. And what my experience of that was, you'd have people that have come from places that have experienced things like hyperinflation. Yeah. So they actually have firsthand experience of what it feels like to have your cash, the value of your cash, go to virtually nothing overnight. The lack of economic stability and, what that means for individuals and how they navigate these environments, which obviously are very different. Although we say that the fact is that Britain has just been through 10, 11, 12% monthly inflation, and they skew the numbers every single month by changing the basket of goods and the definition. Yeah. But by all intents and purposes, we're experiencing high inflation and have done so now for a period of time, unsurprisingly, with the volume of money printing. So that there's a context I think we're lacking here in the UK, and there's just a widespread education gap when it comes to understanding the difference between centralized finance and decentralized finance. And almost every time I post about cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, I get the same objections over and over, even though we've talked about it relentlessly, Sam, around, what if the internet goes off, or it's the pathway to CBDCs. We can address those objections head on, yet time and time again, people are just, failing to look at this with an open mind. And, last night we did our CBDC workshop, which we highlighted the dangers of central bank digital currencies. We positioned cash as a potential solution. But we also contrasted the difference between decentralized finance and centralized finance. And, we talk about central bank digital currencies. Well, cash is central bank physical currency. Like, it's still a central bank currency, which is, the fractional reserve system. It's the kind of manipulated system that drives inequalities. And it's like, yeah, let's defend the central bank system.
Yeah.
People don't realize they're actually defending the central bank system. Whereas in other economies, it's very clear that they have a much lower regard for the central bank system, and therefore, whether it's central bank physical currencies or central bank digital currencies, they're much more bullish on finding alternatives to that centralized system, and therefore they're far more open-minded when it comes to decentralized finance and cryptocurrency. So there's clearly an education gap still in the mainstream when it comes to the UK. We see that every single day here with the work that we're doing. So that's one thing that underscored for me. The broad kind of embrace of other technology types is also interesting, but then the broader kind of trajectory towards other solutions, whether it's health, whether it's permaculture and actually food independence and breaking down the kind of pillars of power when it comes to pharmaceuticals and the food industry. There's just some really, really inspiring things going on out in the other parts of the world, which may have arisen because of other needs. And I think, to me, what I came back is, we've got to break this sense of being comfortable in the UK. And John Bush told this amazing story. We were sat on the steps outside at 8:00 in the morning talking about freedom cells. And he says that people were in the moments of in-your-face tyranny, like we experienced during COVID, people will respond. They'll take to the streets. They'll fill out petitions. They'll rally online. But outside of those periods, we go into these periods of kind of comfort again. But as we talked about last night, the central bank digital currencies, this is a train that's left the station and it's accelerating. So we've got to get out of this comfort zone, I think, in the UK. And some of the other developed countries. And Morelia was really, to me, that was a really eye-opening thing. And the last thing I'll say, Sam, before I pass back to you, is that it seems that a lot of people at that conference were inspired to action out of fear or out of outrage towards that in-your-face tyranny. And some, have been active, like Derek, who hosts the conference. He's been active since 2010, 2011, maybe even before. So COVID wasn't his inciting moment, but for a lot of people inside that seminar, COVID was the thing that awoken their senses and got them into action. But it's very clear that now they're actually being driven by something else. They're actually being driven by a sense of hope and optimism. Not only hope and optimism, but actually this positive vision of what's possible for the future. And I think, to me, that's a much more liberating and empowering sentiment, because then you don't get drawn back into the fear as your kind of motivational source. You're actually on the journey towards something more beautiful, more exciting. So I'm curious to know your take on that.
Well, as you know, Dan, the fear is and the kind of visceral reaction is a great catalyst to get moving. But the real challenge is to keep moving during these kind of, quote unquote, calmer times. As you alluded to there, everything is happening at pace under the surface regardless. It's not quite as in your face as it was during those COVID peak years, but it's still happening. So it's that call to stay on the path and stay on the improvement. I always talk about getting, more decentralized, more sovereign, not as in I've got to make one dramatic step in the face of a dramatic move, but I need to keep on that path. And I think what's interesting out of my, I thought a lot about this in 2020 onwards, where having lived abroad and traveled quite a lot, that there's an interesting difference between some of the more quote unquote developed countries, like the UK, and even sort of, European nations or South America, where what you have in the UK is, I think, a more polarized vision. So you've got a lot more people who absolutely do trust the state, believe in the state, believe the media. And then you've got, a much more vibrant, also kind of a movement of people who are aware of the depth of the lies and the tyranny and the deception. So you've got these quite polarized opposites. Whereas in a lot of, and I've experienced this living in Europe, there's a lot less people who are aware of the deep conspiracy or kind of real deep dark agendas, but there's a greater awareness of general problems of centralized government. So I always say this: if you went into a cafe in Turkey, for instance, in Istanbul, and just asked everybody there, took a straw poll of who trusts the government, who believes that generally they're trying to do a good thing, I'd say absolutely nobody would put their hand up and agree. They would all agree that these are people out for their own interests and not for the people. Whereas in the UK, you would have some people who still believe that there's even though there's corruption, that it's still well intended. Dan. We all see this thing that rather than it being an agenda, they're bungling things and getting it wrong, but actually, they're trying to do their best. But you'd also have people who are absolutely aware. So it's more polarized. But what point I'm trying to get to is that I think in countries where there's a greater awareness generally of the problems, and like you talked about the problems of currency, the problems of centralized government, that there's more appetite on a general level to discuss solutions. So perhaps it's easier, and I'm just riffing here, perhaps it's easier to build some networks even outside the aware communities with people because they see the problems more viscerally. Whereas there's a kind of illusion in these more developed countries that it's not such a problem, and things seem a bit more solid. Therefore, there's not quite that same appetite. So that was my kind of feeling on the differences. But you're absolutely right, Dan. I think the big one is we talked about it that at Morelia, a lot of people were talking about getting away from fiat currency.
Yeah.
Because you're absolutely right. Whether it's cash or it's in your bank as digital numbers, this is a fiat currency. It's a debt-based system. And I know when we talked about crypto and Bitcoin, there was pushback. We even had pushback talking about gold, which is really interesting because saying, well, that's moving away from cash. What we're talking about is moving away from having your value robbed in a currency rather than understanding sound money systems. So Bitcoin is just a digital sound money system version of gold. Gold is a sound money system. So I was trying to make this point that gold is the money of kings and nations. Silver is the money of merchants and traders, and debt, which is what fiat currency is. So understanding it's a debt-based system. The debt is cooked in. That is the money of slaves, of the slave system. So that's where there is this irony of looking at really withholding cash and being very fundamental about it. We always talk about that for privacy of transaction, yes, but you're not dealing with sound money, and you're dealing with a completely centralized solution, which is at the whims of all the issues and all the problems with the people you're railing against. They actually control the supply, they control whether it's legal tender, they control its status. So there are so many issues with it outside of just using it for that privacy transaction. So I think that's where it's really important to understanding the difference between holding value, and having sound money for your energy, your time, and how you want to store that, and maybe even transacting that, and versus cash and fiat currency and its centralized solution. So it was inspiring to hear a lot more people really dynamic, open to all options and economic options, but really saying moving away from centralized currencies.
Yeah.
That was the key. That was the key takeaway, and people were very clear on that.
Yeah, I think it was broad. More broadly, you're absolutely right, and it was broader than that as well. And many of us have already established that global centralization, is the root of this kind of lockstep problem that we're experiencing with whether it's COVID restrictions or whether it's the imposition of central bank digital currencies or net zero policies. It's this centralized governance structure that is supported by and funded by these centralized banking systems, the centralized financial systems. And you're right. These other nations that have a longer term, more enduring skepticism of centralized authorities and the centralized banking system, whereas I think there's a distinct lack of awareness. So when I talk to people about cash and I say, can you tell me what you understand about the fiat money system? Their eyes kind of blur over. They generally can't explain what the fiat system is, or understand its relationship with cash, or understand its relationship with central banks. And people can be rallying against central banks without really understanding what they're rallying against. And that's complicated because it means you don't really understand the root cause of the issues we're looking at. So I agree with you. And it's difficult because it's a paradox, as you said, because in one hand, cash offers that privacy away from the eyes of the state to an extent, because, of course, most people also don't realize when we talk about central bank digital currencies, they think that is the digitization of cash. Well, 95 to 97% of all cash is already digital. Like, people can't get that. Again, that's simple truth. People don't understand because, there was a time we had the gold standard and your money was backed by gold. And then we had promissory notes, the bank notes, which to a large extent, there was backed up by the volume of cash in the system. But more and more, as technology evolved, now it's just numbers on a screen. It's quite literally a digital reserve. The central bank is a digital reserve. They can add zeros ad infinitum. So, the proportion of actual notes and coins that comprises of the total monetary system is around 3 to 5%. The rest of it is digital. So it's already a digital currency, and most people don't understand that. what CBDCs are is an evolution of that. It's a technological evolution of that, as we spoke about on our workshop last night. But these fundamentals are so critical to understand, so you can start to navigate the differences. And I think so. There's the increased skepticism of centralized banking systems in these other countries and other territories. There is also increased skepticism of government, I would say. And again, it's understandable because we have the comfort. Again, I understand it. I understand why we get in comfortable zones. No matter how critical we are of the political system, I would say to anyone, go try living in Nigeria or, a disruptive country, Ecuador in South America, or Mexico, where, half the country is not under, is not in any way, under control with the government. And you could argue that not being under control is a good thing, but you could also go visit parts of Mexico and see how the cartel, in the absence of government, there is cartels. And, I know friends in Brazil who have got the same situation. So we are kind of blessed with this illusion of a fundamental democracy in the UK. But at the same time, that comes with a cost, because what it means is whenever there's a problem, it's like turning to the bank of mum and dad. That's essentially what we're doing. We're turning to the central bank system. Print us some more money so that we can, pay our furlough scheme and keep afloat. Or we're turning to the government, to the politicians. Please, sir, hang out our bowl. Please, sir, please give us this policy. Please do this. And we're always going into this kind of paternalistic state of mind where we're going to the government to solve our problems. Whereas, again, in Morelia, almost the antithesis of that was true. People have almost grown tired of trying to approach change through the political mechanisms, and rather they're actually looking at people-powered mechanisms. And
grassroots.
Almost the day I got back from Mexico, I get like the Bournemouth Echo, which is our local newspaper. I follow them on social media, and I occasionally get news stories. And there was this one story that kind of complained about the state of the centre of Bournemouth. Now, we live just outside Bournemouth, so I don't get to see it that often, but I understand the sentiment of the article. But then they had 800 comments, all people saying it's disgraceful, that the council aren't doing anything about it. The council aren't doing this. Why haven't the council done that? If all 800 people got together and actually said, what can we do about this to improve our town? Because if you look for the evolution of time, how communities have grown and evolved, it wasn't that far back in history where communities would work together to actually develop their communities. They would actually, take pride in their area and actually take an active role in beautifying and improving the state of affairs for everyone in the local community. But we've become so far removed from that, and we've deferred our responsibility to these institutions, these increasingly centralized institutions, so that when there's a problem, it's like, oh, it's someone else's fault. Why aren't they doing this? Yeah. And I get that sentiment, Sam, because that's the system we work in. But we've got to radically shift our mindset. So going to Morelia and meeting so many people who are just like, they're bypassing the state as a solution, and they're going straight for the jugular. They're going straight for the change. So, one person was saying that, there was a lack of green spaces in their area. And they did initially try to go through the government. And it was like always stalling. Nothing ever happened. So they actually rented some land off a local agricultural space, and they built their own parks. Like, it was just, it was inspiring just to hear that. People clubbed together, they shared resources, and they made it happen. You could argue that the government should be the catalyst in the current SAP for doing that stuff, but I just think it's the institutions are so corrupted that, and so bloated. This morning on the radio, they were talking about like most of the councils in the UK are in debt. They're in a debt crisis. And even the councils are now going to the bank of mum and dad and saying, please, central government, give us more money. Please save us. This is the crazy mentality that permeates our culture. So, Sam, I'm ranting again. I'm excited because
you've hit the nail on a really important point, which is community, Dan. And I'd argue that in these more developed, quote unquote, countries that have been more psychologically broken down, that community and family has been more, destroyed and further eroded, and therefore, what you've got more is a more, kind of freedom, truth, and movement, rather than which is trying to do things. But a lot of that is built on belief rather than just coming together with value. So almost going that I think it's easier to build these solutions on a community-based value level without people having to be equally down the rabbit hole together. Now that's challenging, isn't it? Because we always say, where does the messaging go? How far down? But trying to build things on with at that level is very challenging. So the fact that you've still got, and I see this in Southern Europe, Dan, where I'd argue less people aware of the bigger agendas, but more communities still operate at that level, which does insulate them from agendas without them even knowing it, because they have greater structures. They argue they're still more connected to the land, more connected to each other as families, communities, and that is the biggest insulation. That is decentralization just naturally, isn't it? And I think what's so dangerous in these more developed countries is that we become even more divided. And again, they're much more stronger media presence in these countries, and I think that's a real problem, Dan. So that there is less of a general community spirit. And I don't know what your experience was, and my experience in America, just going through there when we went through Houston, and again, it's not fair to say we spent a lot of time there, but I felt the division, Dan. I really did
Yeah,
feel the division of people, that it felt that everybody was scared of each other, and it was hard to connect, and that's a effect of such powerful media machines on these more advanced countries, because the more advanced countries, consume usually more media, and are more brainwashed by the kind of fear and the programming, and they're less working at a grassroots level with each other generally. And I mean, that can be said within countries, from urban environments to country environments. I know, having lived in France, a lot of contacts still there, that things played out very differently in the countryside as they did in the big conurbations, went through COVID, where people were coming together and common sense still reigned. So again, it's this how do we bring each other together and work on things that have a common sense shared value, and they're on our sort of hierarchy of needs, very simple, without trying to build, structures just based on beliefs. And I
totally.
think that's really
Yeah,
hard, and coming together on values, and that's where we can meet the so-called, as Rob Verkerk, I love the way you described it, the movable middle, Dan.
yeah,
Because there are so many factors, and again, the financial system, when people get educated about them, is a key one. But food and all these things we can meet on. Can we meet on values and common sense, and that we need to improve things, rather than try and meet on kind of the real full deep rabbit hole stuff, which I'm fully into and I have been for a long time. But I understand that's very hard to build things based on just those discussions. And I think that's
definitely.
that's where we're at.
Yeah, and the deeper you get on the rabbit hole, the darker it goes, and the more strands of kind of information comes out, and you end up arguing based upon often historical events that are actually very hard to verify, and
Yeah.
it becomes very complicated, and it just gets darker and darker. And I've been down the rabbit holes, and I come back out, and I'm like, well, okay, all the details are different, but actually the principles are the same. Like, it's the same thing. We've got essentially a controlling class that seek to maintain control, power, and influence, and they'll use all kinds of means to do that. And the means may have changed. And we talked about the evolution of warfare last night, and
Mm.
central bank digital currencies in a way are part of that digital arms race. But it's like, when you get to fundamentals, the fundamentals don't change. So it's like, do I really need more examples and more stories to feel bad about in order to spur my outrage, or to spur me into further disillusion of the world? You could. There's a point I think you can reach, and I think you've probably been through that yourself, Sam, where it's like, okay, I see it, but now, like, what am I going to do about it? Because,
Yeah.
like, I can keep burrowing deeper, but I'm just going to get further and further away from the ground, and may lose my footing, and as a result, I'm no use to anyone. So you can have awareness, but if all you do is burrowing to try and find this truth, which is actually very far away generally from the kind of metaphysical truth, the higher truths that kind of govern humanity. But that's a whole different discussion. So,
Yeah, I
what
think,
I
Dan,
think,
I'd sum it up for saying you free yourself from the lies. You've seen the
yeah,
lies. Going to what the ultimate truth is not something I say, I'd leave behind. That's a really interesting, journey, and it's part of our all personal journeys. But it can get in the way of, if I'm just obsessed with that, and finding consensus on any of those points, that can get in the way of moving forward and improving where we all are together, and looking at solutions, and that roadmap. That's why I always think about, we had that great trip, and we saw them recently, the guys from Nourish and Bournemouth. Again, 3 years of just building, 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 whilst they're aware of all that kind of stuff, and you see results and you see improvements,
yes,
and they're building networks that actually have incorporated people that wouldn't necessarily share all the same views as everybody in the
absolutely,
quote unquote freedom movement, but you created net benefits and net gains, and moved the story forward. So it's the both, isn't it, Dan? It's always the both and. the
Yes, both
awareness, the
and yeah.
research, the thoughts about it, and the moving forward and the building. So, as you know, the line that really struck with me from Morelia and the Greater Reset was, you know, it's both exit and build. You know, because often we get the just well exit. Well, then what are we going to build? You know, and thinking about both is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that I think that was key for me is, and again, that takes leadership and it takes strength and courage because, Derek, who hosts the event, he created a really powerful container for those different viewpoints to coexist. And there's always a more cordial environment in physical in-person events. The kind of abuse people throw out online would be very difficult to do so in person. The amount of trolling I get online, I'd be very surprised if people were to speak to me in the same way in my face. They may make the same point, but they'd probably do it differently.
Yeah.
So it's like there's a general cordial nature of human interaction that is different in person, which is an advantage. But it also takes leadership to shape a culture where different ideas can flourish and they can compete. And that's very healthy because you mentioned the kind of values and beliefs, and I shared that point at my talk at the Nourish Summer Banquet last year about values and beliefs, and I think we can come together on values and principles, which creates an enormous amount of space for us to do things differently because there is no one way. And my experience in this movement again is you'll get someone standing up saying we've all just got to do this. This is the only way. This is the one thing we need to do. And it's like, if you examine that from a kind of psychological and social perspective, it's very dangerous. It's authoritarian, it's centralized, it's egoic, and the individuals are usually doing it from a very well-meaning place, but you have to understand the roots of what comes with that in those situations. So it was beautiful to see such an array of solutions in Morelia. And I kind of just want to summarize for people, the kind of scope of the event. So it was a 5-day event. Day one is about liberating your mind, body, and soul. And, some fascinating talks, but it goes back to, in terms of shaping our awareness of the world and taking sovereignty and agency over our own lives, how important it is to manage our health, our mind, our emotions. Even Jason Christos talk going down to some practical elements, things like caffeine can increase our susceptibility to advertising and narratives and messaging. But he opened his talk about saying there's no such thing as a white hat or dark hat magician. It's in the heart and the intention of the magician. There's no such thing as white or black magic, in the sense that it's down to the individual, meaning that the caffeine that can make you more open to suggestion can also work positively if you're actively focusing on your own goals, your own self-improvement. It can actually be a tool, but it's having these awareness of how, if we're not nourishing our body, mind, and soul, how we become more susceptible to these grand narratives. So it's not just about taking sovereignty over those elements of our life. It's actually about understanding the mechanics of the systems that keep us entrenched within those systems. How deep the food systems are, as centralized and monopolized as the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, and how hand in glove they operate. You've got a food industry that makes us unhealthy, and then you've got a healthcare system that doesn't prioritize healthy food, and it's just this intrinsically dangerous spiral. So it was no surprise to see that day two was about permaculture and food independence, because it's essentially taking back our soil, quite literally, and making sure that the foods we eat are nourishing us as individuals and as societies, and that we're regenerating rather than plundering. And I was really pleased to go to a number of those talks, because my experience, Sam, again in the UK, is that because of agendas around climate change, and we're constantly bombarded with people throwing paint at oil at paintings or whatnot, and this really intense radicalized ideological climate discussion. It means that a lot of people actually shut down to really proactive and positive, nourishing conversations about food independence or nourishing the planet or regenerating the soil. So
you're right. It comes back to this greater polarization in the more developed countries, Dan, which is by design, but it's working. It's working in terms of really stopping people coming together and just meeting at those base levels, which is happening more in quote unquote less developed countries, certainly.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, people get called shills for talking about environmentalism. Environmentalism is very different from climate change. The
Yeah.
climate change culture or cult. you know, however you look at it. So it was, again, very interesting to see the different parts of the world and how they're intrinsically linking food independence and how we interact with the land. And again, there's a whole history there, and it's the indigenous culture is far more prominent in the South Americas and Central Americas, and there's so much we can learn from that. And it's we're often talking about what do we need to protect and preserve, our human rights, our liberties, our freedoms, and we're talking about the things that we need to change or progress, but we're rarely talking about the things that we need to reclaim. And that harks back to things that have already been lost. Right now we're defending the things that we stand to lose in real time. But at the same time, we also need to be looking back to history to see how many things have already been subjected to erosion due to centralization of power. And this connection with the indigenous cultures in this part of the world was just fascinating to see, because it opens your eyes to some of the things that we are just fundamentally missing in our Western culture.
And Dad, what comes to me quickly, you just said that, just popped in mind. Partly, I think what we need to reclaim, and I know we're really passionate about it, is good dialogues. And I think we're using the tool of the internet here to get these dialogues out more and encourage them. But it's become more polarized on the internet. And again, we'd argue by design, and that's that's part of the way the algorithm does it, is to divide more and more. But good dialogues between people is what moves the journey forward. Which is why it was so key to keep people separated during the COVID years. They understand that good dialogues get people together. But as you clearly pointed out, I've had amazing, endless good dialogues with people in person, as you have. And we gave a presentation in Devon last weekend. Great dialogues. It's not fractured as it is online, because online it only takes one voice, and it may be a real voice, or it may be a 77 grade, who knows? But it takes somebody with just coming with strong beliefs and not wanting to get involved in dialogue that really causes sort of disruption and chaos. Whereas in person, that does get filtered out, and there is much more growth or whatever. So I think reclaiming that, reclaiming forums of good discussion, grounded discussion, exploration, not trying to get anywhere too quickly. And that's part of the illness of, give a solution. We've talked about that. One of the most hilarious comments we've had was somebody on one of it is saying, I'm 7 minutes in and you haven't got the answer yet to, the answer to everything, including and that's part of it. But it doesn't come from that. It comes from getting together, and discussing and reclaiming that ground.
Yeah, and my retort to that was, well, according to the creation story, the world was built in 7 days, and we can't even have 7 minutes to explore a possible solution. So give us a chance. So then, following from the kind of permaculture piece, there was the agorism and then parallel networks. And again, I think different parts of the world are further ahead when it comes to parallel networks and parallel structures and alternatives. And I think there was a really healthy discussion around the intersection between parallel structures and existing structures and societies, because there's almost this perception that we need to create this off-grid, completely disconnected society that is far removed from what we know and love right now. And we met plenty of people that had moved from Canada and America to Mexico because they wanted to escape the in-your-face tyranny that they'd had. But there was also people there from Mexico, from America and Canada, who have stayed in their respective areas because they love the environment they're in. You're on the coast, or their family are there. They had their family up, they had their own personal upbringing, and they don't want to leave. So they're looking at how actually we can start to permeate the existing structures with these alternatives. And I think that was a really, really useful kind of parallel in stating that, this parallel ideology, this idea of, well, not ideology, but the idea of creating power structures is something that's alongside, it's adjacent to, with the view to making something that's better than it's already there. It's like technological innovation. All of a sudden you get, a product that surpasses what was previously being used, and everyone migrates to it because it's just better. It's the same approach. And again, there were some really great stories around things that were happening, and also I just saw how simple people are making it. Just making it really easy, bite-sized. Melanie Rubin, who's coming up on my show soon, talking about you should build this checklist for parallel society. Build your parallel structures, and it really, what it boils down to is the simple steps that you can take to reduce your, if you think about it in simple terms, the simple steps that you can take to reduce your reliance on centralized systems, relation or your dependence on centralized systems. And all the answers are out there. Really they are. Unfortunately, with some of the technological solutions, crypto being one of them, is that they are still in their infancy when it comes to their development and adoption. And as a result, like many kind of epochs in technological innovation, they are usually for the technologists themselves, which is why there's a level of complexity and jargon that makes it difficult for the public to surmount, at least initially. But that will change. And you always talk about, Sam, how we're pioneers. And I think that's important because you've got to jump through the hoops. You've got to take the responsibilities that comes with the freedoms if you wish to take them, because the alternative is you remain passive and you remain a victim to whatever the centralized structure imposes upon us. You can non-comply, which to a degree will mitigate or safeguard you against the harshest forms of tyranny, but it isn't going to move you forward. It's a defense mechanism rather than an attack mechanism. I don't know.
No, and I understand people's desire
but you know
to
what I'm
step
saying.
straight, straight to solutions. I understand it completely, but I think it's not owning the fact that the pioneering path is a pathway rather than a step into another system. And I think I always use that term, I don't know, settling into that process, because it is a process. And that's that's probably the frustration of the person who left that comment, sending love to them. Like, they do want a solution in 7 minutes, they want to know, they're in fear. But that's just not the reality. And I think we can forget, and again, that's part of the perceived comfort of this world, that we want another comfortable, a different one, a comfortable alternative. Well, actually, the road to pioneering change is not a comfortable one, and you have to go through. I know people who've been on healing journeys of all sorts, whether it's physical or know that the actual path is through. There's no going round it. There's no suddenly arriving. It is through. It is the process, and that's part of being human and accepting that. I say when I talk about acceptance, it's not being defeatist to accepting the way the world is, and it's you want to change, but accepting that it's a process, accepting where we are, and that's okay, and we got to go from there. And that's where, Dan, I like when we go in a room or anywhere, or even listen to people, let's meet each other where we are and see where we can go.
Yeah. And then the fourth day was about taking back our technology, which, again, there was a very healthy discussion. And I'd be interested in your views on this, Sam. Some almost surprising answers from stage about how we embrace certain tools and flip them on their head, and how we use some of the centralized tools to our own advantage to get ahead. How we can actually use some of these tools to accelerate our own progress whilst developing these decentralized alternatives. And even with some of the impositions that we're facing, things like digital ID, there were some really interesting discussions around how you can create decentralized, privacy-focused tools of authentication. So it was a very nuanced discussion, and a nuanced discussion that people aren't usually willing to have because they operate in these polarized binaries. And I think we've got to look ourselves in the mirror and realize, we're part of the problem when we are falling into the trap of binaries, because that's the trap that's been set. It's a trap that's been set. And if we find ourselves in this deeply puritanical, polarized perspectives, we're no longer willing to listen. We're only ever putting across our own points of view. And as a result, we're missing a whole range of holistic understanding. So I think it was a very brave move to actually address those realities, because it won't appease the Puritans. It won't appease those, and nor should it, in my view. If you're only playing to like the edge of the bell curve, we're missing all the opportunities to actually advance. So I was quite impressed with the way that the discussion was laid out. But ultimately, I concluded that we're at a point where the technology can curtail our rights and surveil us, or it can liberate us. And as you always say, the technology itself is neutral. It's how we deploy it, and I think there's a rich opportunity for us now to accelerate our own path through these tools of change.
I thought that day was a perfect example of transforming these binaries into a good open discussion. But it's neat that people on the panel there were neither pro or against, and we see that so often, people coming pro-tech, anti-tech, puritanical views on either side. And you had people who are deep in the technological awareness who are giving all the nuances. And you're absolutely right, understanding that the tech of even, it comes into like social credit score style systems that we choose to be part of because they benefit us, have value, and they exist. and again, I'm not saying this because you have to like Airbnb and Uber. I'm not saying they're amazing companies, but you happily would use them because the rating system works. But it's about your choice. So there is a place for technology. It's always about the top-down imposition
Mm.
and the obligatory nature of it, and the enforcement of it, rather than the iteration of this tech, which has all that purposes, and you can choose if that suits your needs and purposes. So there is great, it's not as simple as anything digital and ID is awful. It's dystopia versus we must have nothing. So it is getting that balance in, and I thought the points are really important, and I agree with them, which is that term digital arms race, Dan. There are
Yeah.
lots of tools that are helping us get these messages out, spread awareness, bring people together. That they live streamed it all on Odyssey, which I've often discovered is a blockchain based platform that's not being censored. And if they put that on YouTube, it may have got taken down. So they're using those digital technologies to the advantage. And I think John put it very well. We had a really interesting session around AI, which is again a rather divisive subject, but needs nuance. And they really brought that nuance about AI, and arguing that if you can harness these tools that exist, and they're not all evil. There are totally different versions of them. Some of them are great tools. Some have said they're going to use AI to create a huge body of work around alternative health. That means people can search, vast knowledge of alternative health in a very efficient way. They're going to use AI to create that. So the AI is not, it's how it's harnessed and the intention behind it, Dan, as you said earlier. But, I think the real important point which stuck with me, which is any way you can use these tools to forward with good intention our goals of greater freedom, greater awareness, whatever, I totally support that. And that's the difference. That's where you can get the Puritans who really want to get stuck in not doing anything that's had any hands of anything on it. I was giving the example of the Bitcoin. Has there possibly been a hand in that at some point by a nefarious actor? Possibly. Has it also helped people do amazing work for the last 3 years? Educating people, being able to transact and, outside the system, debanked? Yes. So again, it's that puritanical idea that can be a block to actually using tools that further the progress and evolution of greater freedoms, greater decentralization. And so using those tools without spending, being sort of paralyzed into, I can't do anything because this might be not 100% pure or we don't know. And I think those can be real blocks to moving forward because really what we want to do is move things forward and progress.
Yeah, I'm never surprised by those kind of comments, but it's just I understand the sentiment, but this unverified possibility that some DARPA actor may have had some involvement, or CIA may have had some touch on the CIA on Bitcoin. It's almost impossible to prove, but what we can prove is that the central bank system is completely constructed by these actors.
Yeah. So that's the puritanical view. If you're going to be puritanical, you have to get rid of everything. So it's like
you have to get exactly. You have to tap right out of all of that, but they're not doing that. Yeah. They're not doing that. In fact, they're not just not doing that. They're advocating for it still. It's like, well, you're saying we can't go down there just in case this thing has happened. But you're staying in the system is completely broken and completely built by the most corrupt actors.
Well, it's like the manipulation question, Dan, because manipulation exists everywhere. That's just realistic. And people say I don't want to get involved with Bitcoin because the big players might be manipulating the price. Well, they've manipulated every market, but I educate about that once you understand that, there's still greater trends beyond the manipulation. But you're not seeing that the ultimate manipulation is your debt, the debt instrument of debt that's being centrally controlled in your pocket. So it's always weighing up against each other rather than just looking at one without looking at the other.
Yeah, that reference, absolutely. Yeah. So again, that technological discussion was powerful. And then the last day was really about free and conscious communities. And I think there was a level of discussion around how to actually build local kind of freedom networks or freedom cells. And John Bush is on a real mission to take that forward. There's discussion around intentional communities and different forms of living, and that was kind of something that permeated the entire conference. But more broadly, there's a kind of really refreshing conversation around how we build a free culture. How and I always say that politics is downstream from culture, and the future we're creating will not come necessarily from the changes we make today, but actually from the long-term trajectory that's created by creating a kind of paradigm shift in our culture, the pendulum swing. And I think it's undoubtable that the kind of economic and cultural elites have pushed close to the boundaries of the edges of where this Western culture is now a breaking point, and maybe it's got a little further go to break and send the pendulum back the other way. But the signs are already there that the reaction or response to everything that we've witnessed in the last few years on steroids is accelerating the path back, the path back to freedom. And so, I take great comfort in that. And there was conversations around the future generations and, how do we build the free societies of tomorrow? What kind of education do we need in order to build, freedom-loving individuals from children to adults, and how we do that in a healthy way without indoctrination. So how do we build conscious, aware, creative young minds without imposing things upon them? It's a fascinating discussion, and there's just so much there. And again, in terms of education, due to regulatory pressures in the more developed world, there is less room for alternatives. But with the point around developing alternatives, it's the Airbnb. The Airbnb example is a good one because they, according to this letter of the law, they were a business that wouldn't pass the regulatory frameworks, but because they grew so fast, the rules had to bend in order to allow that business to continue to exist. And I think we've got to create such pressure through the education alternatives, for instance, that the regulation has to change because of people power. And we don't get that just by simply lobbying. We have to create the solution that is superior to the incumbents. And to me, the whole event was really inspirational in looking at the kind of seeds of change, some of which are kind of still at the kind of plantation stage. They're just beginning to kind of come to fruition. Others which have really kind of grown roots and shown pathways to possibility. And then some just truly innovative approaches, just blown away by the kind of innovation in light technology. That I don't know if you were there, Sam, you saw the demonstration of this new bulb that can actually replicate the impact of the sun. So, for indoor growing, you can, get all of the kind of a large spectrum of the known light rays, which can, accelerate natural growing and, replenish the soil in ways that we've never seen before. So that, there's just some amazing technological leaps within this movement that are just, incredible to see. So yeah, what a 5 days. You had your amazing workshop, Sam, outside as well, in the bright Mexican sunlight. But
what that showed to me, Dan, because that was, I had Mexicans there, Canadians, Americans, people all over the world. And again, when you get into the basics of the centralized financial system, this is something that everyone can relate to. This is a topic that does cross borders. It is worldwide. Everyone can relate to it. So it was great to, be connecting with those people in different parts of the world and having those conversations and always like we had both in Morelia and in Devon, motivated people who are looking to be pioneers and build. And you kept saying, Dan, that word was build. If you're seeing the collapse of what's coming on, and some of that's, a controlled demolition, but the point is you've got to be building to have things to fill that void that's coming, because that's how the dark magicians like to work, is they like to destroy and have a ready-made something to fill that void, to corral people into. The point is we need to be building structures because there is a void, and I think we can all admit now there's a void opening up. There's a space there. But how do we fill that space? If we leave it and we're passive and we're just obsessed with the collapse and their plans, then we're not filling those areas and providing alternatives and structures and building. So that factor of exit, within reason and your own time, what you can at your own pace, but also build. That's what really struck me, and that's what's exciting.
Yeah, and that it dovetails with the kind of resist and rebuild kind of philosophy that we're building at Free Humanity. It's the story I shared from stage, or attempted to with my dodgy voice at the time, only still recovering now, as you can hear. But there's a town in Mexico where the women of the town actually kicked out the cartel, but they didn't stop there. They kicked out the politicians, the police, the council, and they rebuilt from the ground up. So it took that resistance to kind of create the space in order to build. But I think it's in the wider culture. It's again, it comes back to and both. There are plenty of things that require resistance right now, whether it's digital ID, central bank digital currencies, the World Health Organization treaty, and more. But if that's all we do, then there is nothing. We have no solution. We have no alternative to replace those things with. And until we get really focused, I think in the United Kingdom, this is my call to action, is across those paradigms we've talked about, whether it's health, whether it's finance, whether it's communities, whether it's technology, it's connecting with what's happening on the ground and supporting it. We're all busy people, and some of the best ways we can support is with our wallet, choosing to unsubscribe from your media subscriptions and support things like independent podcasts. It's, finding ways to detach yourself from the pharmaceutical industrial healthcare complex and take on natural approaches to health. It's detaching from the centralized banking systems and finding ways to diversify and to embrace, digital and decentralized finance in order to move that ahead. It's educating yourself on all of these things. So, Sam and I were discussing, like, how do we conclude this conversation? How do we give practical steps? And we joked about it because it's sorry, I still am recovering from this bout of ill health that I unfortunately experienced while I was out in Mexico. It's get educated, it's learn, learning enables you to find your own path. But given that the nature of this conversation on this podcast is really about the financial system, it's about understanding the perils of the central bank system and the trap that it lays, and understanding the alternatives, whether that's diversifying your holdings into things like precious metal or fully embracing decentralized finance. And there's loads of tools out there to help you with all of those things.
Yeah, I understand, Dan. It's getting moving. So again, it can sound like a broken record a bit. Get educated, get moving, and get the dialogues going. I always say this when I give a talk that, what I hope to inspire is also more people coming back together, being a catalyst like we are, but actually continuing that dialogue, because it's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing learning process. And there's no time ever wasted in terms of having discussions and learning. Just because the solution isn't completely fully formed and done, doesn't mean that any time looking at it and discussing it is wasted. The wasted time is really just being sat in fear and in thrall of the agendas that are where there and going deep into those. That can feel like wasted time. That's where, for me, moving forward and being proactive does transform the energy. And as we've always said, once you're in motion, whether it's yourself or with your family or with communities, things start to happen, and then doors start to open. You didn't even know doors existed. These things are not going to come and knock on your door. Solutions don't come and knock on your door and say, here we are. You've got to go and find them. And, there'll be ones that, unique to you that you'll have found, and then you can share. That's where the magic happens. So staying open, I think that's one of my biggest things, Dan, is staying open despite what you're aware of, because they want people to feel like it's a closed door, that the roadmap is set. It isn't at all, but that's part of their messaging to make you feel that it is. We've got to stay open, because that's where the magic. Stay open to the possibilities and go from there.
Absolutely. So, to conclude, if you're interested in learning about decentralized finance and how you could embrace this emerging asset class, fully acknowledge the similarities between central bank digital currencies and decentralized finance. They're both being built on this similar technology platform. They both offer the potential to transact and store value. They're both digital. They're both durable. They're both acceptable. They're both portable. They're both divisible. They're both uniform. However, central bank digital currencies are unlimited in supply. They're inflationary. They're centralized. They're subject to opaque monetary policy due to the whims and mercies of the central banks. They're closed. They require permission. They risk seizure. They're invading your privacy. They enable censorship. Whereas Bitcoin and other decentralized assets, they're limited in supply, or can be. They're decentralized. There's clear monetary policy. They're open and permissionless. They're unconfiscatable. They're privacy conscious. They're censorship resistant. So, sorry, folks, we gotta learn about these key differences. And if you want to do that, then you can join us on our Navigating the Digital Assets program, which is Sam's course. It's a 3-part course. It goes through the good, the bad, and the ugly, very holistic way to assess this emerging asset class, the pros and cons, and how it contrasts with the current system, the history of the current system, and why now is the time to consider these alternatives. So head over to weareelevate.org/digital assets to check that out. We'll put the links in the comments. But let us. Oh dear, I'm like that guy from the Far Show. Do you remember your horse? Losing it now. I didn't bring any water, so it's good time to close out. Hopefully on our next show, I'll be back to full health. So, Sam, any closing comments before we wrap up?
No, just let us know. Let us get the dialogue going in the comments. Give us your thoughts. Give us things that are happening that locally, and let's focus on solutions. Let's move things forward, and let's come together and be solution focused. Keeping that awareness, but not being stuck down the too dark rabbit holes for too long. Let's always come up and get air and see what's possible and get excited. Because as you said, things are collapsing. This is a catalyst to create better solutions. Not just to mitigate what's happening, but actually to look at forward things and do things better than we've ever done them, any of us. So that's where I like to shift the energy. And when you shift the energy, things change from there and things work better from there.
Absolutely. And I'll close by saying this. If you like the sound of the Greater Reset event that we've just attended in Mexico, or the People's Reset as it's now known, well, the good news is Derek and I are talking about bringing the event to Europe in the United Kingdom, and we're hoping to do it this side of 2024. So watch this space. So if you sound excited by what we've shared, the Solution Focus Conference, do let us know in the comments. And also, across those 5 areas that we've talked about today, the themes will remain consistent for the UK event. So if you know people who are operating in solutions in any of those areas, do let us know, because it'd be lovely to make some connections ahead of organising the event. So watch this space. Exciting news coming. And thanks again for tuning in. Please do share this, and hopefully you've enjoyed this conversation.